Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adi, and today we have a team report from the Charlotte Regional Championships, and I am joined by Gouging Fire's strongest soldier. I'm joined by Luka. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know you,
Mhm.
do you want to
Doing-
introduce yourself?
so I guess my name's Luka Trejgut. Started playing competitive Pokemon back at around 2014, 2015, around that era. By the time During that time, I was a senior, so played during that era. Stopped at around 2017. Started Gen 7. Picked it back up around 2019, 2020. Then took a 3 year long, 2.5 year long break for you know COVID reasons. But second that came back for 2023, I went full force, and I feel like I've been doing pretty well so far.
Yeah. You've been popping off ever since last year, Charlotte, where you think you got top four with a King Gambit team.
hmm
You have been doing especially well at almost every regional that you get to bring King Gambit to, and this one was no exception. Running it back and finishing top four at this year's Charlotte regionals.
hmm
Um,
Uh,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
I don't think there's been a single event I haven't brought King Gambit to. I'll be real.
So
I can't remember. I can't remember one. I can't remember.
in that case, the team building process should be pretty clear, at least where it started from. Talk to me about how you developed this team and maybe how you approached at the start of this format.
So the start of the format was really finicky. I would say it's just because a lot of this is the most change we've had in the format since I'd say like Regulation D, when just like a lot of powerful Pokemon were introduced all at once that just sort of changed the whole scape of the metagame and threw out a bunch of things we thought were good and just you basically had to start from almost entirely from scratch. It felt very similar here, not entirely from scratch, but like a lot of powerful things were introduced that definitely changed the scope of things. Like Raging Bolt was obviously a very good Pokemon. Entei is a very good Pokemon. Just like a lot of like, it's just kind of changed like a lot of the ways we have to focus on team building. And I couldn't really, I was struggling a lot in the early format. I was testing around with like Latias comps and stuff like that before I realized Latias is kind of bad. And it took a while to like, I kind of found any kind of footing, but eventually I ran into this Gouging Fire team on ladder, and I was like so interested because I'm like, I have no idea what this guy does. But I realized I didn't even know Gouging Fire could get a boost from speed. I thought like its stats were skewed, so it couldn't get that. But as soon as I found out it could, I was like, oh, this is like Regulation E, like Roaring Moon. You like supportive Roaring Moon, it has like fast breaking swipes and acts like as a supporter. Except like it's not weak to Fairy, so you don't have to commit to a Terra or anything like that on it versus Flutter Mane. And then it gets Howl, and as soon as I learned Howl, I was like, oh, I
Hmm.
like this guy. I love Howl as a mechanic, as a supportive option, especially since like at Fort Wayne last year, I got top four at Fort Wayne using Howl Arcanine just because I really really liked Howl. Uh, and so as soon as I saw it got all that, I was like, okay, it's gotta be this guy. Like as soon as I saw, especially since I saw how well he synergized with King Gambit's, because giving King Gambit Howl Boost is obviously great because you can't mitigate it with Intimidate, and also it acts as an Intimidate deterrent. So I was like, I was sold basically immediately. So starting with the team building process, I was like, you have to start with Gouging Fire King Gambit. So obviously you just got to go from there. And it's like obviously you have to have a bunch of strong physical attackers because you want to be able to abuse Hal properly. So the immediate one I started with was Ogerpon Wellspring. I thought that one was just obvious because the type synergy is just super good. You get the Follow Me because that's just an incredibly broken option. Ogerpon's just an incredibly broken Pokemon in my opinion, and it just synergized so well with the typings, with the special defense boost, with all that. I just thought it fit too well. Um, and I think the next mon just immediately added was Fluttermane. I didn't think there was like another reason to use a different mon just because Fluttermane is just also a very broken Pokemon and also just added a special attacker and it just also offensively synergized super well with like all the other pieces that I had at the moment. And it fit on just too well. Fluttermane fits on every team basically. That's when team building kind of took a turn. The one problem with building with Gouging Fire is it's obviously a good fire type, but the one issue with it is it doesn't resist fairy, and this format is kind of hard pressed to find fairy resistances at times. Like, I think of like Entei, I think of Amoonguss, and like those are like the only like two I can think off the top of my head that are like prevalent in the metagame. You know, something like Goldengo's kind of been phasing out recently just because a lot of things are really good into it. A lot of Pokemon resist steel moves. So it's been like I was trying super hard to like see if I could fit a fairy resist or something like that. I was trying like double fire types, like potentially changing Pokemon water to fire. I was trying like Entei with gouging fire. That looked hilarious, by the way, but it didn't work. I was trying Amoonguss, but I was like, you know, Amoonguss was really good, but I was also like not liking how kind of like slow the team was feeling, not kind of liking how Ogerpon and Amoonguss kind of filled similar roles on the team, where like it felt like, you know, it was kind of just too samey. So it was really hard pressed to find that. Um, Eventually, and this was actually I was working on this team with Ashton Cox, and he ended up bringing a different version of it. This was a version that I had theoried before, which was Rillaboom P2, with the idea being that P2 is really good into like Tailwind teams, and it's really good at like Trick Room teams because it's in reverse Trick Room, and it's obviously really bulky. And then it would also have Rillaboom for Fake Out support, which would also like synergize well with both Gouging Fire and P2, because P2 would be able to abuse the Breaking Swipe support to not to functionally be an incredibly bulky Pokemon that would just, after physically mitigating it by having a lot of special defense investment, your P2 wouldn't be able to get knocked out very easily. And then with Rillaboom Grassy Terrain support, it essentially gives both these Pokemon lefties, which mean they just became very, very survivable. And I was really liking this version, but I was running into a couple of issues where it was hard to get immediate damage on the board. Like, Gouging Fire is much more supportive based. Ogerpon was invested to be more of a support Pokemon, as was P2, as was Rillaboom. Like, Fluttermane and Kingambit were my only like real strong immediate offensive Pokemon, and at times it would like struggle to bring one or the other into the matchup. It struggled to be like it would struggle to have fast and immediate damage. And the other issue that I ran into was like teams like Archaludon, which are picking up in popularity. Archaludon's really difficult to deal with, especially since you don't have any kind of fighting move on this team. So it would actually just be super hard to just deal with it if it ever got a single defense boost up. Like, the game plan would just be like set up Kingambit to try and deal with it. But if it ever got up any defense boost, or if you're like me and if you fought two different Fairy Terra Archaludons in Swiss at Charlotte, that plan would have been completely out the window anyways. So those are my main gripes, and that's why I went back to the drawing board. I was like, it can't be P2. P2 makes a lot of sense, but it just needs it needs to be something else. It needs to be something that can not only help with Tailwind, also kind of patch up like a Lando Eye weakness that the team kind of had. Even though it was dying off a little bit, I still wanted something more for it, and also had to be something that was like good into Archaludon stuff. And that's ultimately when I decided, like, kind of last minute, that it was just Chen Pao. I was like, Chen Pao just makes the most sense here. It offensively deals with Tornadus, offensively outspeeds and one-shots Landorus, and it has Sacred Sword, so it doesn't matter how many defense boosts that the Archaludon gets. You can just chip it down, Sacred Sword it, ignore the defense boost, and just deal like 60-70% to it. It was definitely the right call after, like, a lot of soul-searching the night before Charlotte. But yeah, like I had tested with the Chen Pao before. It was definitely really good. Like, my one gripe the Chen Pao brought was just having 3 fire weeks. I was like super worried, like running into like something like Entei or like any like strong fire type attacks. So that was the only reason I was like super hesitant on Chen Pao. But I'm like the fire types I fought, I managed to deal with by like Terrafiring Rillaboom or just mitigating with Gouging Fire, who has a 4x fire resistance. It overall didn't come up as much as I thought it would, and Chen Pao ended up being an incredibly good Pokemon. Chen Pao was brought to so many games, and it carried its weight so hard. I'm very happy I ended up picking Chen Pao.
Yeah, so when did you feel like you had your team ready, or were you locked in? And how much did it change after seeing the results of Portland Regionals 2 weeks before Charlotte?
Yeah, so Portland didn't... Portland was so strange just because, like, I feel like the meta from Portland is completely different than the meta Charlotte ended up seeing. Like, I feel like so many are, like, I don't know if you saw, like, how Portland got... Dondozo got second place at Portland. And I don't know if you saw, there wasn't a single Dondozo in day 2 of Charlotte. Not one. Like, and that was insane to me. I was like, wow. Like, the meta shift from, like, Portland to Charlotte was huge. So I was just trying to, like, kind of just ground myself in my own thing. Like, I was trying to not pay too much attention to, like, what had happened at Portland. I was, like, I obviously was testing, like, certain comps and certain teams that I had saw at Portland. Like, I was interested in Alex Underhill's team, like, the team that he had brought. I tested it around with it. I wasn't super vibing with it. I didn't like the choice. I never liked Choice Band Dragonite as a concept. I just thought it was super one-dimensional, was countered too much by the meta. I was just never a fan of it. Neither was like the Raging Bolt, especially safety goggles. I felt like too weak in too many scenarios. Anytime you weren't fighting Moongus, it was just like doesn't have an item, it's just not doing a lot of damage. I did like the concept of like having like Chen Pao, Fluttermane, Ogerpon, and like I'm happy that like that. I feel like that kind of overall ended up impacting where I went with my team building because I did kind of like those cores that were there. So I think like overall I'm happy. Like I just kind of grounded myself in seeing. I see Gouging Fire. I like Gouging Fire. Gouging Fire is good into like Chen Pao D Knight. It's good into these kinds of teams, like these very balancy, supportive, like Roaring Moon kind of teams. I really like that, and then they just kind of like the rest of the team ended up just being okay. Balance is patched. Let's just try and see if we can patch up Tailwind and Trick Room as much as we can, and just have like a good comp ready for that. The biggest gripe I remember having is the night before Charlotte. I never wanted to actually end up locking Dark Terra King Gambit. I'd never like Dark Terra King Gambit was not good into the current meta. It just didn't. The extra damage was never worth it. But I couldn't find anyone who had Terra Shards in time because I didn't have the Terra Shards. My friends were asleep at the time. I didn't want to wake them up because I didn't want to wake them up and say, hey, I need Dragon Terra Shards. So I ended up just locking with the only King Gambit I had in game, which was Dark Terra. There was like a couple games where I ended up being decent, but overall, I really, really wish it had been Dragon Terra. Just because it would have been a really good way to have another fire resistance. It would have been a really good way to just resist a lot of elemental types. That is overall the biggest regret, but I'm overall super happy with like how the rest of the team ended up being built. Gouging Fire was just built to be super bulky, super tanky, just support the team with Breaking Swipe and Howl. Like it took, especially on the physical side with Breaking Swipe, it was taking no damage, and that was great. And like Rillaboom was then kind of, and after Rillaboom was added, it was meant to just like not only support and heal everything, but also like be this just incredibly big special defense tank. That's why you see I have so much special defense investment in Rillaboom. It's actually able to survive Terra Normal Blood Moon from a Life Orb Blood Ursula Blood Moon, which I thought was like super important because I need something that's like good into that kind of matchup. So then coupling that with like Water Ogre Pawn into those kinds of matchup, I was like, I felt fairly confident to like Ursaluna teams just because I had mods that could actually like take these super strong normal moves. So overall, I think like the way I built the team was very solid. Fluttermane was meant to be faster than every other Fluttermane I fought, and it did end up working because every Fluttermane I fought was slower than me, which is really good, especially on a team that has no fairy resistance. You kind of just have to deal with Fluttermane in a very offensive way. That's also why the Chen Pao is jolly, because between Howl Boost and Stellar Terra, you can just decide to one-shot and outspeed Fluttermane at almost any given moment. So, and Fluttermane ended up never giving me any issue. So overall, I'm happy like how that ended up working out as well. So overall, I think like the team ended up being balanced in a way that like it felt like it had answers into everything. And if a matchup was negative, I could still play out of it if I had to. Which I overall ended up doing more than I would have liked, but it still ended up working out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so you mentioned a lot of the EV spreads, a lot of the item choices, but do you want to talk through the individual Pokemon and maybe anything that you didn't touch on, or like some of the more specific what the EV spreads do?
Yeah. Actually, funnily enough, the Ogerpon, this was my mistake, I'm pretty sure, but it was supposed to be Jolly, but I believe I had ended up making it Adamant by mistake. And luckily I didn't fight any situation where that ended up mattering, but I feel like if I had fought like more Lando I than I had anticipated or something like that, and I had noticed that, because I didn't know until like halfway through the tournament that I was actually Adamant. And so if I had lost a game to like a Lando I outspeeding me and I noticed that, I would have been devastated. But thankfully that interaction never happened. So I think if you were to go forward with this build and make the Ogerpon Jolly so you wouldn't have to deal with that situation, but there was a single set where Ogerpon being Adamant actually, like, I'm almost certain it mattered because it KO'd a Fergraph at like 40, 45 with Ivy Cudgel, and I was shocked. I thought that was a crit, and I saw it wasn't a crit. I was like, okay, that's just like a not Fizdef Giraffe, I think? But no, it turns out I was just Adamant. I was like, oh, okay, never mind. That's good. I'll take it. I'll definitely take it. But for the EVs, like, again, Rillaboom, specially offensive just for like the super special like Chiyu Flutter, Fire Terror in that matchup, or Similar Blood Moon, take the Blood Moon, that sort of stuff. The Gouging Fire never felt like it needed more HP investment than it had. I just EV'd it to outspeed like Adamant, Scarf, or Shifu, and if you were to fight that, so you can just like get a breaking swipe off before it ever like CC'd or anything like that. And then I just gave it enough attack to the point where Heat Crash, either with one Howl boost or next to Chen Pao, it OHKOs most Flutter main you fight, and also OHKOs most Amoonguss that you fight. So giving it like enough attack investment to do those kinds of things was like a really good way to deal with those kinds of Pokemon. King Gambit, I never saw a reason to do anything other than 252, 252. Just make it as bulky as possible and make it hit as hard as possible. Like, there's like very few EV benchmarks that it needs to hit, like other than those, and I never saw a reason to do anything else than that. Flutter Main's just, it lives basically every like combination of Chen Pao, like Adamant, Icicle Crash, the Jolly, Ice Spin, any variation of those, basically it lives. And then I just try to make it more EV invested on the HP side, just so it too could also take special hits better, because Flutter Main's a pretty specially defensive Pokemon. Like, if you invest in HP, it can actually take special hits very, very well. So I tried to give it as much HP as I could, because I never felt like I needed more like defense other than like the few benchmarks that I needed. So like overall, I was happy with the Flutter Main spread too. Perish Song ended up never getting clicked, just because I never ended up getting the matchups that like it would be good into. Perish Song was meant for like certain Dondozo comps and certain like super supportive Iron Defense body press like Goodra or Registeel stuff, just so you can just have an end game of KOing two Pokemon than just Perish Songing. Mm-hmm. So overall, I would still keep Perish Song just because fighting that kind of stuff is really annoying. I never felt like I needed anything like Icy Wind or Taunt or like Thunderbolt, and then none of those moves ever felt like they were necessary. I like the assurance the Perish Song gives you, because it gives you like an out. It gives you another like way to end game or like another line into certain teams. So I really liked the choice of having Perish Song.
Did you click
Yeah, no, I did not click it once. I never clicked it. It never came up. But like, I'm thankful to have it. Like, if I were to fight any of that, I would have been kicking myself that I didn't have Perish Song. So, but I would still always keep Perish Song. Like, the only other one I would ever consider is like Trick Room, but Trick Room's not really a button you click. That's just a button that makes like opposing Trick Room players think a little bit. Even though like I 100% would never plan on clicking it in the matchup. It's just to create a mind game that isn't there.
I think Arbin had Protect last move on Fluttermane, and we asked him if he clicked it on Scarf or Shifu, some sort of Scarf. I think it was Scarf or Shifu. We asked him if he ever clicked.
I think
that.
it was
No.
banned.
Banned? Yeah.
Banned.
Yeah, we were like laughing, like, yeah, no one ever clicks the fourth move. So good to see that's still the case. But yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, because you do have 5 physical attackers on the team and a Fluttermane. So if you run into one like a Registeel or something, I could see it being really problematic if you don't have an out to it.
Yeah, no, I was like, I have 5 physical daggers. I don't want to deal with Iron Defense body press stuff. Like, obviously, I have Sacred Sword on Chen Pound that can deal with it, but like, they can just tear out of their weakness, and most of the time they do commit tear on those teams. So I was like, I just want an out. I can play so long as I have like a single out, and I'm just like, okay, I'm just gonna knock out 2 Pokemon, Perish Song, and just I'm not even gonna try and deal with it, because my team can't deal with it. So I'm just not even gonna try to. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, overall, I would keep Perish Song. Happy to have it.
And then the other really interesting choice you have is you have Stellar Chen Pao, Stellar Terra type Chen Pao. How did you feel about that, and did you ever click that?
I actually did click that quite a bit. Because to me, Ghost Terra is like if you really need help into opposing like Chen Knight, opposing like E-Speed, immunity, something like that. I totally understand when you need that kind of thing, but Gouging Fire has such a good opposing Chen Knight matchup just because of Breaking Swipe's actually able to mitigate Inner Focus D-Knight's offense, because it's normally immune to Intimidate, but it's not immune to any other kind of attack mitigation, being like, Breaking Swipe. And also because D-Knight is so disincentivized to E-Speed into Gouging, because if you ever Burning Bulwark as they E-Speed into you, suddenly the Dragonite is burnt, and it is now just no longer a threat. It's no longer threatening knockouts. It's no longer threatening like any kind of like significant damage. So between that and between having a Fluttermane who's obviously really good into that kind of matchup, I was like, I really don't need Ghost Terra. Ghost Terra is like not needed, and I'm almost certain I won't click it just because like if I ever run into this matchup, I already have enough tools to deal with it. So I just ended up, and it's especially since like on this team in particular, I think Jolly was like really needed. I was like, okay, so I really just think like if there's certain situations like I need to like Oko a Flutter Mane or like Oko this Mon with like Sucker Punch or something like that, then that'd be really nice to have. So I just put on Stellar Terra as a way to like just decide that I want to like KO something, decide that like this Pokemon's at like 70%. It's not normally in Sucker Punch range, but I just Stellar Terra, now it is in Sucker Punch range. It overall just also played super well with Howl. Like you can just have Gouging Fire, Chen Knight, and since Gouging Fire outspeeds Chen Pao, you can just Howl Stellar Terra, and suddenly like, Icicle Crash is threatening a one shot on like anything that's neutral to it. So overall, having the extra offense, I think, helped a lot. There were like a lot of games where I remember there was one game in particular where like Enershifu switched in on my Icicle Crash. It took like 25-30. Later, it switched in on my Stellar Icicle Crash, took like 35-40, which then put it in range of the Stellar Sacred Sword, meaning that my Chen Pao was effectively able to deal with Enershifu, which was really, really cool. So yeah, no, Stellar Terra was fantastic. I think it's very team specific. I think if you have a very, very good, like, Chen Knight matchup, good into E-speed stuff, then I would consider Stellar. Otherwise, like if you need some kind of matchup check into that, always go Ghost. I think Ghost is very, very good still. But I think on this team specifically, Stellar is just really, really good.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I guess I don't have any other questions. It seems like a lot of the other sets are reasonably standard or things that we've seen before. I guess I haven't necessarily seen before at a regional level, but certainly I've seen it on ladder, like stuff like. But yeah, I guess so. The next question is, tell me about how you actually play the team, and did you have any common game plans that you went for, or teams that you had to do very specific game plans into?
So I did like how this team felt like fairly flexible into a lot of the meta. So versus just like let's say like Underhill-esque teams, Chen Pao, D90 kind of teams, you would just typically just do a game plan of just like Gouging Fire and like either Gambit or either like Ogerpon, something that like just you can just decide to protect one of the slots, breaking swipe them down, mitigate their damage, and then just kind of go from there. You can just breaking swipe again, put them to -2. Suddenly, both Chen Pao and D-Knight are threatening damage. It works the same with Entei, because Entei also is mitigated by breaking swipe. So against those kind of like very priority spamming teams, like that was like the kind of teams that Gouging Fire was meant to deal with. Like you just lead Gouging Fire in that matchup, and you just spam breaking swipes, and you mitigate their damage to a point where they're just effectively not able to do enough to come back from it. And like if they switch out, then they're just taking more damage. They're not gaining any momentum, and you're just abusing the fact that they're switching out. Against like Tailwind teams, and Tailwind teams were like probably the ones I feared the most going into the event. The like we saw the rising uses of like Glamora Tailwind, like Dark Ursh, Flutter Mane, those kind of comps. And in practice, those were fine, but they were very read based. It was kind of just like oftentimes it would just be like leading Chen Pao plus something, or like leading Ogerpon Flutter. Like Ogerpon Flutter, there were quite a few times I just went to go to Flutter Ogre because I'm like, it's either this lead or nothing. It's like it's either I outplay using this lead or I don't have an effective solution. It would oftentimes be like I have to either lead Chen Pao, KO the Tornadus immediately, and then just play my way out of like the next 3 turns of Tailwind, whether it be giving up a Mon in order to just like stall for one more turn, or just like basically just KOing Torn, dealing with like the one threat that the team has to deal with in order to close out the end game. It like more often than not, they would always kind of come down to reads, just because I feel like the team's not super great at stalling out Tailwind turns, especially against something like Dark Urshifu, which Dark Urshifu definitely gave me a lot of issues, especially since like Gambit could just not really do much in that matchup. My best answer was like Chen Pao and Flutter Mane, but Flutter Mane still takes a lot even if you commit Terra to it. So those kind of teams, like I would normally just bring like Chen Pao, Rilla, Ogerpon, Flutter. Like it would usually be like Chen, Rilla, and then like Flutter, Ogerpon in the back, or I would like just swap those backs and leads and just do Flutter Ogre. That was like the main way I had to approach Tailwind. Otherwise, it would just kind of fall apart. And you did have to get a significant amount of reads right in that matchup, which thankfully I was getting, but it was not like sustainable in the long term overall. So overall, it has a Tailwind matchup, but it's very sketchy, I would say. Trick Room Ursaluna was a little bit better. Like I never actually got practice versus like the one that got second, which was the like Tailwind and Trick Room. That one I actually had no experience with it. I had actually no idea how it would go into that. But like against like the Trick Room one specifically, Trick Room one like felt fine because you can more often than not like abuse the fact that the Trick Room like getting Trick Room up lead was fairly passive. It would normally be like a lead of like Incin for Rigarath or Ogerpon for Rigarath, and like that's a fairly passive lead. So you could often just times do something like King Gambit Fluttermane. You could oftentimes just like set up a Swords Dance for free in front of them. You could just like Dazzling Gleam, not KO either Pokemon, because in those kind of like situations they want you to KO something like their Ogerpon, or like they want to like immediately pivot out with their Incin in order to bring in the Ursaluna. So that's why you just oftentimes lead with Gambit. If they lead with Incin, you get a +1 for free, and then suddenly like they can't really switch out. Otherwise, then Ursaluna would take way too much damage, or Farigras being threatened with a knockout. So you can oftentimes just like abuse the passivity of a very hard Trick Room oriented lead with like just punishing them and not KOing them so they can't get their momentum in, and then just have like a very strong like defensive back with Ogerpon Rilla, who both Pokemon you can just commit your Terra to Ogerpon and just have two insanely big special walls that can just deal with the Ursaluna in the end game. So overall, like the Trick Room, like Ursaluna teams never felt like an issue. I only fought one, I believe, in Swiss, and it ended up being not an issue. So I thought like that matchup was very, very good. And then versus Side Spam, I think this team has like one of the best Side Spam matchups I've seen, just because you have two Dark types and you have Rillaboom, along with like a Ogerpon Water who can Terrastalize. Like it, I fought one Side Spam in day 2, and it was just an incredibly good matchup. Like it felt like my opponent couldn't do a lot, because no matter what, like I was never being threatened by Expanding Force. Rillaboom could just always come in and just neutralize the threat of Expanding Force anyway. Especially since like King Game had like hard walls like Iron Crown. Like the Iron Crown I fought was Calm Mind, so it didn't even have any kind of like Terra Blast or Focus Blast or any kind of tech move that could deal with it. So it just like hard walled both Indeedee and Iron Crown. And then they would have like Tornadus or Shifu, but obviously Tornadus can't do anything to King Gambit, so it just ended up being like have just deal with your Shifu and King Gambit just wins the game. But you have obviously you have Rillaboom and Ogerpon who are both very, very good into Urshifu, especially Water. So Side Spam was like definitely like one of the best matchups going into it, and like I was expecting Iron Crown to be on the rise, so I felt very confident going into that if I were to fight any. And the one archetype that gave me it was such a weird, interesting matchup just because of the ones I fought. But I thought like Archuludon Rain, I was talking about how I needed Chen Pao in order for that matchup to feel better, and it did feel better with Chen Pao. But the problem was though the few I ran into were Fairy Terra. And since there's Fairy Terra, one of the lines I have into that is to like support King Gambit and just get a Swords Dance on it, and then just one-shot the Archludon before it even gets defense boosts up. So it's not gonna tank any defensive hits if it doesn't actually get hit in the first place until it's just a one-shot. But they were Fairy Terra, and I just couldn't do anything with that line. I had to like come up with a line on the spot because of that. So like the lines I ended up doing were just having to like hard rely on Fluttermane in order to actually damage it. So I would just do like Rilla Fluttermane, fake out just Terra Fairy Moonblast, sacrifice it if I have to in order to get enough damage in the Archaludon so I can actually deal with it in the end game. And even then that was like a fairly scuffed game plan. So just because they were Fairy Terra, if they were Grass, it would not have been an issue at all. But yeah, no, that one was finicky. But the two Archaludon Rains I fought, I did beat. So it was good enough overall to deal with. So it was very finicky, but I'm just happy it worked out. So overall, I would say the matchups into most teams were like fairly neutral. Like one fairly negative, one very positive, and the rest were like fairly neutral. I'm like, that's about as good as a team can get. One negative, like one positive, and like most neutral. I'm good with that. I can deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, on that note, tell me about your tournament run and a couple highlight matches from your day.
All right, tournament run. The first match that comes to mind is I remember people were telling me this guy's like a local demon, Matthew So, and I remember running into him and seeing the gouging mirror. And if you didn't know, the gouging mirror is really bad, just because like you both have to obviously like lead your gouging. That's just the most effective thing to do. But you just get into this big game of chicken where like you kind of have gouging gambit on both sides of the board. It's like, are you gonna breaking swipes? Are you gonna howl? Are you like, what are you gonna do here? Like, but this matchup was heavily in my favor because I didn't mention it earlier, but I had Fairy Terra gouging, and Fairy Terra gouging was there not only for Dark Shifu, that was an added bonus, but it was meant to specifically beat the gouging mirror. Because if you're, since obviously gouging has the same weight as an opposing gouging, Heat Crash only does 40 damage to it, which is obviously really, really weak. So if you Terastallize into Fairy, you're now not only immune to breaking swipes, but it means that the opposing gouging can't actually mitigate your damage. Since breaking swipes never connects, that means your attack's never going down. So you kind of just end up getting this game where you just set up, you just Terastallize your gouging, and you just keep setting up howls that they just can't mitigate because you have King Gambit gouging, so and you're now a fairy type, so they can't breaking swipes now. And Heat Crash does no damage to your gouging, so they can't breaking swipe it. They can't Heat Crash it. They can Heat Crash it, but it does like 10%. So like you just get into like this big war of attrition howl war where you just both sides just keep setting up howls, but you end up being on the better side of it because you're fairy and they can't actually mitigate your damage. So I was overall, it ended up being a very clean sweep just because of that. But like I was super hard pressed to fight the gouging mirror because I was like one of the most uncomfortable mirrors I've ever had to take part in. Then let's see. I ended up fighting. Yeah, no, I remember I ended up fighting. My round 8 was actually interesting also because it was also another gouging mirror, but this one was even scarier because one, they were also fairy gouging, and two, their team was crazy looking, and I had no idea what to do into it. Like they had such insane things like Iron Boulder didn't scare me at first, but then I saw it was substitute Sacred Sword. I was like, oh, Gambit struggles a lot there. It can just set up a sub in front of my my Sucker Punch, and if I decide to counter, they could just Sacred Sword me, and I'm like, oh, this is bad. This is so bad. Both games ended up being decided to me getting a turn 1 read correctly, where we led like gouging. I led like gouging Rilla. He had led like gouging Hands, I think. And I had just predicted in game 1 that he would just protect his gouging to try and get Scout a burn on me or something like that, and just attack with Hands. So I just faked out and howled, and that was enough momentum for me to take the game. Just kind of Terastallize my gouging, keep the boost, and then just Woodhammer, Breaking Swipe, KO the Iron Hands, mitigate his damage. It was basically, it came down to turn 1 on who got that read right. And game 2, it also kind of ended up being down to that because he ended up leading Iron Boulder gouging, predicting my King Gambit, and I led Rilla gouging again. And literally, I had to just make the call again. I called him to protect his Boulder and try and set up a howl with his gouging. So I faked out into his gouging, even though I risked getting burnt, and got up a +1 again, which meant Grassy Glide actually O-code the Boulder afterwards. So I was like, okay, this game should be set for him. And it ended up being really, really close, but thankfully with some really, really hard reads in the first few turns, I was able to close that one out. So overall, gouging mirror, especially if both are fairy, it's really horrifying. I do not recommend getting that mirror ever.
I can believe it. But yeah, so you finished out day 1, you went 8-1, so you were in a really good spot going into day 2. Yeah, tell me about your day 2 run. 6 rounds, day 2 first time ever.
6 rounds was, as soon as I like remember hearing about that, I was like, oh, if I make day 2, this is gonna be a brutal challenge. And it kind of was, because I remember being really tired towards the end of it. Like I gotten so accustomed to 5, especially since, oh god, can we talk about the DCs in round 1? Oh my god. Yeah, so it was literally everyone was playing, their round 1 of day 2, and it was the middle of my game 3, and I had put myself into a position where the game was like practically locked for me. All I really had to do was like ensure that an Icicle Crash hit onto an Amoonguss, and the game was basically mine. And then the entire everyone playing their matches DC'd, and it was literally like they were starting to just, everyone had no idea what to do. Everyone was in a panic because everyone was like in the middle of their games, and everyone DC'd. So at first the judge is starting to rule out that like, oh, it's just going to be ties if like the Pokemon count were the same across both fields, and people were like, or people would be awarded wins if like they had more Pokemon than the other person. and everyone was complaining, and and rightfully so, everyone was complaining because that was like, that was it was a really dumb situation, and no one wants to, get a tie or have a match decided like that, especially since like being up 4-3 doesn't necessarily mean the person was winning. Like you could be a mon down, but momentum could be behind you, and you could like easily knock out the rest of your opponent's Pokemon. Like that doesn't dictate who is actually winning or anything like that.
I thought the rule was you have to be up 4-1 or 3-1 for it to be considered a win.
I think it was something like that, but like they were starting to like rule out ties and stuff to people who were like matching Pokemon and stuff like that, which was also just really not good in my opinion. They eventually did decide that everyone would just replay their game, so it ended up being really, really scary since I was fighting Sohybe, and I don't think I didn't like my matchup into Sohybe because I was telling you about how like Tailwind teams were kind of uncomfortable, especially like this Arcanine Urshifu kind of team. I was like, this is really, really uncomfortable, and the matchup was just not super great, just because I was talking about how Tailwind was like super finicky, especially since like Arcanine Urshifu kind of Tailwind was also really finicky, just because that's actually mitigating my Chien-Pao's damage output, and Chien-Pao's a big part of my Tailwind matchup. So that one was just really, really rough. And since the matchup was so rough, having to go to a fourth game with this kind of matchup I was like so horrified, because the only way I won game 1 and was about to win game 3 was just because I got a lot of calls right. And game 4, I ended up just having to get like another really hard call right. I think like I ended up getting like a double up into his Flutter Mane with Ogerpon and like Chien-Pao or something like that. As he, I think, like attacked into my Chien-Pao, thinking that my Ogerpon was like going to switch out or something like that. I don't remember the specific details, but it was some kind of like read like that ended up like putting me into a good spot, so I was able to win the fourth game of the set, even though there should never have been a fourth game. But like thankfully I was able to start 0-1 that day, or 1-0, sorry, 1-0 that day. And then immediately after, I had to fight Justin Tang in a very similar matchup. This was definitely like an omen to start, because I ended up fighting this exact 6 at least 3 times in day 2. And obviously, Justin Tang is someone I fought, a very, very good player, someone I had a lot of respect for, and having to fight him immediately after in a matchup that I'm not very particularly happy about fighting, I was like, this is going to be rough. This is going to be really, really rough. Game 1, I remember being really crazy, because he had led Tornadus Chiyu as I led Chien-Pao King Gambit. And this was the one situation where like Terra Dark actually was kind of good, because if you didn't know, on 4 HP Chiyu, Sucker Punch into Terra Dark Sucker Punch and next to Chien-Pao actually picks up the KO on Chiyu. And I was just hoping that he didn't know that, so I went for it. But as it turns out, he actually had a little bit of HP investment, and I had gotten like minimum rolls on both Sucker Punches, so he actually barely lived with his Chiyu. But then he ended up missing a Heat Wave on my Chien-Pao, and my Chien-Pao then got its Sash intact as he knocked himself out from Life Orb Recoil, which ended up definitely being the saving grace of the game, because it meant like Urshifu came in, he couldn't like Sucker Punch my Chien-Pao, because like obviously I was still at full HP, so I was able to just like get a crash off onto his Torn, get a Sucker Punch onto his Ursh to break its Sash. Overall that game, the miss ended up being a lot in my favor, but also it was ended up being crazy that he ended up living the double Sucker Punch. And then game 2, I remember coming down to like a very big read of like how he had like Glamora Urshifu, and I had my Ogerpon Rillaboom. And and both of my Mons were in Sucker range, but I just predicted that he wouldn't Sucker Punch over the threat of Follow Me on Ogerpon being there. So I was able to just double into his Urshifu with Glide, Horn Leech to barely knock it out. And then I ended up being barely able to knock out his Terrid Glamora, because it was at around like 20-25%. I wasn't sure if Ivy Cudgel would actually knock it out, but it just barely managed to knock it out, and it just barely managed to take the win. And it was such an insanely close set. Like, that set had me shaking towards the end of it. But yeah, no, Justin Tang, really good player. Was really, really, really good to be able to fight him again. But never want to play a good player like that in that kind of matchup ever again. Definitely not.
Yeah, and of course you did. You did have to do that.
I did have to do that multiple times. Oh my god. As we'll say, like, and I talked about fighting Side Spam, and that was actually Aaron Clemens, who I had fought using Side Spam. The matchup was overall very much in my favor, and I think like I just sequenced it correctly. The Galarian Zapdos sadly never came. I really wish it did because I would have loved to see what it could do. But he just ended up bringing Torn Ursh, Iron Crown, and Didi both games, and it was just kind of a can I deal with Urshifu to set up Gambit to just kind of win, just because like three of those mons they just can't touch King Gambit. Like he had to hard rely on Urshifu being able to actually deal with it, and I just played it in a way that I would just KO Tornadus immediately with Chen Pao. Then I would just kind of slow play it, like bringing in Rillaboom constantly in order to change the terrain, forcing the Indeedee back out in order to swap the terrain in, then punishing the Urshifu as I would come in order to, just knock it out, have King Gambit win the end game then. That's basically just what I did both games, and I was just thankful to have a really, really good side spam matchup, so I could just play that just relatively well and not have to play out of my mind or anything like that. So that matchup felt very, very good going into that. But then I had to fight a really good friend of mine, Steven Mia, in the next round. And surprise, surprise, he's using the exact same six that Justin Tang was using. And the very, very fun fact about this match is me and Steven have fought at Charlotte Regionals for the win in day 2 on stream already before. Like we ended because that's the exact same situation we were in last year. We were both 12. We were both 11-1. Whoever won the next match got into top cut. We had to play on stream with both of our X1 records, and we just could not stop talking about how history was just repeating itself. Then also I was just really, really scared because Steven's so good at this game. He's like, I feel like he ends up just not playing for months, picks up the team in 2 days. Like he picked up this team in 2 days and then got top 8. Like that just shows you how good this guy is. And then we played on stream, and the matchup again is the same kind of scuffed, but the difference between his version and Justin Tang version was that he didn't have Ghost Terra on Chi Yu. It was actually Fire Terra, and that was definitely very much in my favor because it meant I was able to just lead Chen Pao Rillaboom into that, and I was just able to fake out Sacred Sword into it for basically there was basically no worry of ever Ghost Terroring or ever just being immune to that because it was just always a guaranteed play. So that being that, just ended up having that option and then having to just get a few reads right into that matchup was ultimately what ended up winning it for me. Like in game 1, he protected his Tornadus as I just doubled into his Chi Yu, which I was so shocked seeing that fake out Sacred Sword actually doesn't KO the Chi Yu because I'd actually learned later on that the Chi Yu was bold. And I was so dumbfounded to learn about that because it just lived. I'm used to Chi Yu's just folding the Sacred Sword outright, but then it lived the double up, and I was just so. It ended up being kind of in my favor because it meant he didn't get a free switch in, so I was able to just get a double knockout on the next turn without taking any damage on my Pokemon. But then I had just kind of had too much momentum riding behind me, and I was able to just Grassy Glide Sacred Sword into his Urshifu. Neither of my Pokemon got knocked out that turn, and Steven he had 1 Pokemon versus 4. He just didn't have enough tools to come back from that. And then game 2 was like sort of similar because I just led the same thing, but he had adjusted with Ogerpon, Glamora. But since I'm like threatening Icicle Crash Glide on both Pokemon, Steven's forced to like follow me in that situation, which means Ogerpon just goes down relatively for free. Glamora got a Meteor Beam off, but obviously it doesn't KO Chen Pao because it has the Focus Sash. And then next turn I just kind of set up an end game for my Flutter Mane. I just Sucker Punch to the Glamora, I Grassy Glide to the Urshifu to just basically set up a situation where Flutter Mane can come in, the Urshifu Sash is broken, then I can just Sucker Punch Dazzling Gleam, and he can't just do anything about that. He's forced to protect the Urshifu. He brings in Chi Yu after that. Urshifu can't get a double protect, so it just gets knocked out, and since I have Ogerpon in the back, the game was just over from that point. So definitely like very early game, very read heavy, and it just kind of comes down to like who kind of leads better and who kind of gets the right reads. I'm overall just happy I was on the good receiving end of it because Steven was on an insane tear. Like immediately after this match, he went on to beat Wolf. Like he was on an insane tear. So I was so happy to just get this win.
Yeah, and speaking of Wolf, you played him in the last round. I don't know if this round is very serious given that you guys were both locked in.
So we actually never played this round. So Wolf actually had both Ashton and Steven in his resistance, and I wanted them to do as well as possible. So I ended up just forfeiting to Wolf because I wanted to better both of their resistances.
Hmm.
Um, it's like I didn't want to like take any. I didn't feel like I didn't want to screw them over in any way if like I ended up winning that match. I thought it was just overall better to not only help their resistances, but also it's the end. It's also round 6. I'm really tired. I want to get something to eat, and like Wolf felt the same way. So I'm like, I think that this is overall better for everyone, especially since like I don't really have anything to gain. I was locked for cut at that point.
Hmm.
Winning would only mean glory and also screwing over my friends. Like it was like it just made too much sense to just forfeit the match and just not have to play it out.
Hmm.
So yeah, that match ended up not happening. But then we just ended up going into top 8 versus Enzo, and I was scared looking at this team. I did not know what to think looking into this team. I saw uh, I saw Blood Moon Tornadus, which I was like, okay, that's insane. I saw Smeargle, I'm like, that's really insane. I saw Dark Terra Choice Band Urshifu Dark. I'm like, this team's insane. Okay.
Did you have some time to
So
look at it before you started Top Cut?
yes, I did have some time just because I saw the standings and I saw me and Enzo were 4th and 5th, so I knew we were going to end up facing. So I was like looking at his team and like trying to think about a way to approach it. I actually couldn't figure out anything reasonable until like the very last. I couldn't figure out anything reasonable till we were up on stage because we ended up waiting on stage for like 15 minutes because I don't even know what was happening. I think like either the commentators were like talking a lot or like something was happening behind production. But like we ended up staying on stage for so long that I ended up just thinking about the matchup, and I ended up like overall figuring out that the matchup is definitely always leading Ogre Pond Flutter and then having Gouging Fire in the back because I need Gouging Fire to deal with both the Entei and the Goldengo. But it's not good as a lead here because he's obviously just going to lead Torn plus a sweeper, either a Shifu or Blood Moon. So I'm like, I have to lead like a very good lead into that, but I have to have Gouging Fire in the back in order to deal with these mons. And I still did have to make quite a few reads. Like in game 1, I predicted to Tailwind and U-turn off of my Ogre Pond because obviously Urshifu's Dark is threatened a lot by Fluttermane. So I just end up Terra Fairy Moonblasting into his Tornadus to knock it out, and then Ivy Cudgeling into the switch in, hoping it was going to be like Entei. It ended up being Goldengo, and like I did get a crit on that Ivy Cudgel, which there was a lot of luck in that game 1, but I do think the Ivy Cudgel crit was really the only thing that ended up mattering because he did bring in his Entei. I brought in my Gouging Fire and a switch in for the Make It Rain, and he ended up missing a Sacred Fire onto my Rillaboom, but at that point he had been at -1. The Sacred Fire would not have knocked out. I know that for sure. And all that really meant was that I was able to just get another glide off without having to worry about being burnt. Especially since I saw when Urshifu came in, Sucker Punch actually managed to not KO my Gouging Fire, even at like around 50%, which I was really surprised about. So I was able to just get another Breaking Swipe off there, and to end up being at -2. He did miss another Sacred Fire, and I was like, honestly, I kind of wanted that one to hit, because honestly, I kind of wanted Rillaboom to go down to get a free switch into my Fluttermane, because I was just playing towards a Fluttermane endgame at that point. All I needed was enough Breaking Swipes on the Entei for it to not be able to hurt my Fluttermane enough, and then just enough chip on Entei for Fluttermane to win the endgame. I never needed Rillaboom to like tank those attacks or like dodge those attacks. It just like ended up me dodging 2 Sacred Fires in a row. I was like, okay, I guess I'm just incredibly lucky for no reason. But yeah, no, and because of that, like I had the game locked without even needing Fluttermane. So I just ended up locking in that game 1, and then game 2 was just like I think was a lot cleaner. It was just a lot more adjustments because he saw how U-turn didn't work out, so I just predicted him to like just go straight for a KO on Fluttermane, Wicked Blow that turn. So I follow me Dazzling Gleamed, just got a free knockout on Urshifu, got good damage on Tornadus, and then he brought in Goldengo. I was almost positive Goldengo was going to go for Nasty Plot just to like set up because he saw Gouging Fire just swapped in and took the Make It Rain very well. I didn't think the Tornadus was actually swapping out into Entei. And I understood why later on because like he wanted to save it to get another Tailwind up, but I was relatively okay with both my mons being knocked out at that point, that I just went for an attack and I just got a free Ivy Cudgel Dazzling Gleam off in that turn because he swapped and clicked Nasty Plot, which overall was really, really good for me because I meant like I could sack my Fluttermane, protect my Ogre Pawn, bring in my Gouging Fire, just get the K on the Goldengo without taking a lot of damage on Gouging, but not enough to be like in an E-speed range or anything. And then overall in the end game, because I saved my Terra, Fire Terra Rillaboom was able to close out the game just because Tornadus is forced to click Tail in there. He attacked on my Gouging Fire. Rillaboom was then just, since resisting Sacred Fire and Stomping Tantrum's not even a 2-shot, it was able to just close out the game from there. So overall, much cleaner game 2. But overall, still very, very scary, and definitely came down to me getting a little bit lucky and me getting a lot of reads right.
Yeah, this team is spooky. I played his brother round 1, Ian, and I had a nice. Also, I had like 45 minutes to look at his team sheet because we took so long to start round 1 as well, and so I think this team is a lot scarier when you have 90 seconds to figure out a game plan and not half an hour.
It became so much like I would not have figured out a game plan if I did not have that much time for sure.
But yeah, and then so moving on, you finally did get that matchup with Wolf, and this was also on stream, of course. Tell me about this matchup from your perspective.
This matchup was really, really rough. So the way I have to play this out, at least in my mind, is I need King Gambit to be in the lead because I understood what Wolf wanted to do. I understood that the game plan is consistently pivoting around with his 3 pivots with double U-turn parting shot. I understood that the Ferrograph was a lot more of a threat than it looked to be because of the Throat Spray Hyper Voice. Like I understood like that was like the game plan he was probably going to go for. Ogerpon did not seem good into my team because Gouging Fire 4 times resists both of its stabs. I don't think there's a way to bring Ogerpon into my team. Fluttermane didn't also seem good just because like I have good, especially defensive Pokemon for it. It needs like time to get the Calm Minds up. I don't think my team would let it have the time to get the Calm Minds up. So I was like, he has to bring these 4. I knew he had to bring these 4, but this is the situation where not having enough time to get the Terra on Gambit was the biggest factor. Because I was Dark Terra, that meant he was kind of just free to U-turn and CC off of my Dark Terra Gambit. And I was unable to, and I need Gambit in that early game, because, my early game is Gambit in order to deter him from pivoting out constantly and, setting up board states that are beneficial for him. And it'll also mean that, he can't do that, because so long as King Gambit's staying around, he's always threatening, a Kauta Cleave into one slot. So it's always threatening a KO into an incoming Farigiraf, because he needs to bring in Farigiraf at some point to deal with the rest of my Mons. But he can't do that so long as Gambit's staying around, constantly threatening a Kauta Cleave into one of the slots. So being Dark Terror in this situation was just horrible, because it meant if Gambit's not able to sustain itself enough in the early game to a point where he's able to just CC it, Flare Blitz, etc., just deal with it super well, so it's knocked down the first 2 or 3 turns. And then after that, the rest of my team is just a bunch of physical attackers with no way to mitigate that. Howl's not enough when you're constantly parting shot intimidating. So all my Pokemon just ended up getting Intimidate cycled the entire rest of the game. U-turn was doing so much chip because both Rillaboom and Ogerpon are weak to U-turn. Parting shot was just it was free into Gouging Fire because Gouging Fire can't actually block parting shot even with Burning Bulwark. So once Gambit went down, the rest of the match just ended up crumbling. It overall just felt like there was a very little I could do, because I felt like my game plan was very set in stone in what I had to do, but King Gambit just didn't have the staying power with the Terra that it had in order to actually do that. I feel like if I were to play it out again, I would have tried and gone with a different game plan. I would have tried to do probably Rilla King Gambit again. I would have had to make some reads on the CC hard switching Gambit down to Gouging, something like that. But I would have had to play I think out of my mind in order to actually get that into a favorable position for me. So overall, Wolf played it incredibly well. Cannot say anything about that. He obviously played it amazingly well, but definitely a very, very rough matchup that I would have loved to have a second chance at if possible.
Yeah, and I mean I can see how the Terra Dragon King Gambit would flip this matchup completely. I mean, so many of his Pokemon struggle to hit Dragon types with the exception of the Fluttermane, right? So yeah, that it is really unfortunate, especially to have that come up finally in top 4. But that being said, it not meaningfully coming up until top 4 is still really convenient, and I'm glad that you had such a great run despite not getting to lock in the exact team you wanted.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, speaking of
Like,
that team, the rental code is on screen right now. If you want to try it out yourself, I know you mentioned a few changes that you'd like to make, but definitely would recommend trying out the team either in its current form or in the version that you've talked about with the slight changes, the Ogre Pawn spread, the King Gambit Terra type. But yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think like overall the team is still very good. I would recommend changing it to Dragon Terra King Gambit. I think that just matches up so much better into the meta. Um, I think obviously you should change the Ogre Pawn to be Jolly instead of Adamant, so Lando Y doesn't give you a hard time. But like overall, other than that, I think the team's like generally really solid. I think it just has like a lot of good components to it. Being able to mitigate attacks with breaking swipes, being able to boost up all your Pokemon with Howl, just having a lot of strong like priority with double Sucker Punch, with Grassy Glide, a lot of speed while also having a really good defensive backbone with Pokemon like Ogerpon, with Rillaboom, with King Gambit, with Gouging Fire. Like it's overall just like it's not I wouldn't say it's like a balanced team, but it's like a very like bulky offensive team. This team has very good offensive elements. It's able to overwhelm Pokemon in a lot of situations, but it's also able to like take hits and mitigate damage very well. So like I overall really like this like unique balance that this team has and like how it kind of matches up to a lot of the metagame. So I'd recommend this team for anyone trying to like play non-Tailwind, non-Trick Room, like non-speed control oriented teams. I would recommend this kind of team.
Yeah, definitely. And I would not be shocked to see, we saw a lot of Gouging Fire in day two of Charlotte. Would not be surprised to see a lot of it at day two of Liverpool coming up, which I guess time of posting this, it might already be over coming up, or Knoxville this upcoming weekend. But yeah, it's a really strong team. It's an archetype that I think I personally was disrespected a little bit going into this tournament, and I was really impressed by how well it did. And I did lose to Matthew So, who was also on it, and so maybe gave it a little more respect. But yeah, so yeah, congratulations again on your run. Did you have any
Thank you.
final words or shoutouts that you wanted to give?
I will shout out Ashton because he was the person I built with for leading up into the event. He was the one who listened to all my dumb ideas and rejected all my dumb ideas. So I have to shout him out. We'll probably be working on something, hopefully for Knoxville. So hopefully make up for not winning the event. But so I have to shout him out. And then I'll just shout out all my friends and my family. Everyone knows who they are. So I'll just shout them out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it. Again, we've got the paste in the description down below, and the rental is on screen right here if you want to. Here there it is. If you want to check it out. And yeah, thank you again for coming on the channel. Appreciate it. And until next time.
Of course.
Yeah. Until next time, which might just be after Knoxville regionals when you when you find a new King Gambit brew.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Yeah. Until next time, I'll see you all later.
All right. See ya.